So good evening. Thank you very much for having me here. This is going to be a theme that comes up a few times through this talk, but I've done a lot of these presentations with horticultural societies, garden clubs, sort of since this jumping worm issue really started in Ontario. You folks and gardeners and people who have been very engaged with this topic and very aware of it and passionate about it are really a big part of this story and a big part of the solution. So right from the get-go, I'd like to say, thank you for that. So hopefully I'm able to fill in some of the blanks if you have some questions about this, hopefully address some of the concerns and worries, and people can leave here feeling a bit better equipped for dealing with this particular issue. So I'm going to start with some very basic background about sort of earthworm invasion, because this is part of a broader story. I feel over the years of doing this kind of work, people are becoming more aware of this, but to sort of start out with, most of the earthworms that we have in Canada are actually non-native species, primarily from Europe. We had native North American earthworms that were largely wiped out during the last glaciation. The soils were essentially wiped clean, and then about 14,000 years ago, when those glaciers retreat, you have a soil that works really well for earthworms, but doesn't have any in them yet anymore. So they're sort of susceptible to that kind of invasion. And this is a global process. So we have non-native earthworms kind of mixing and matching around all the different continents except for Antarctica. So that's kind of the context that we're working with here. As is often the case when we talk about invasive species, humans are a major part of this process. Worms don't move very quickly on their own, and so we're really the ones that are responsible for moving them quickly and long distances. This is a human-assisted process. And worms, and also their cocoons, we'll get into this later, but those are little jumping worm cocoons there, just looks like a little speck of soil, basically. These can be moved around in a variety of different manners. So this can be in ship ballast, horticultural materials, soils, plants, mulch, people dumping bait, especially on sort of northern areas, that's quite common, road work. These can get trapped in the treads of vehicles or shoes, all manner of different ways they can move around without us knowing about it. To give you an idea of the sort of kind of spatial pattern that you can get from this, we get some interesting patterns here. So let's say you have a hypothetical population here that's sort of a decent size. They can then move to different areas potentially very quickly, very far, through any of the vectors that we just talked about. And then now you have a brand new population somewhere very far away with kind of nothing in between. And then those will, of course, grow over time, and any of those can become sort of sources for further spread as well. If you go around Ontario, you'll actually find a lot of places with tons of earthworms and then sort of nothing in the soil yet. They haven't got there yet because it's got this kind of patchy distribution because they're hitching a ride with us for the most part. And then the subsequent spread from that they do on their own is actually very, very slow, but also happens as well. So an important question to address, especially with, I think, sort of a gardening background is, are earthworms good or bad? We get these different narratives about worms, and it's sort of the unsatisfying answer of it. It kind of depends. It really depends on context. So the things that we think of as good from earthworms are good in the right context, right? These are decomposers. They take organic matter, they break it down, they free up nutrients, they aerate the soil, they bioturbate the soil, they mix it around. And all this is really great if you're trying to have an agricultural field or a productive garden, sort of places or native habitats that are used to having them, used to having these kind of effects present. So that is all true still. The bad basically comes about when we look at situations where we have earthworms doing their thing in ecosystems that are not adapted to those kinds of interactions. So some of the problems that we run into, for example, would be that rapid decomposition. Decomposition is very important, but when it happens quickly, that can expose the soils. So seedlings can struggle because nutrients are being freed up faster than they can use them, and they can be leached away. You can have them taken up by invasive plants. You can have very granular, loose soils that are eroded away. Essentially, these interactions are bad for plants that aren't used to them. And part of the challenge is that these two different situations where they're useful, where they're not useful, often they can become connected as well, right? So generally a sort of somewhere like a garden or an agricultural field, that can become a source for them to move into, say, a largely undisturbed forest where they do then become a problem. So to move into jumping worms specifically as sort of the topic of interest here, historically when we talk about earthworms, what we're usually dealing with is this kind of first wave of earthworm invasion. So this is the movement of species primarily from Europe into North America, and this goes way back right to the beginning of when European colonists were coming in. So ship ballast, sometimes it was intentionally moved, all sorts of different ways, and this is going on to this day. So we're talking about hundreds of years of European earthworm species being moved from one continent to another. Now recently, and this is what we're focusing on today, is what we would now call sort of this second wave of invasion. This is a different group of species. They're coming from Europe, from Asia rather, and is much more recent. This is mostly because of changes in historical patterns of global trade. Now we have more connectivity to different parts of the world, so we have species coming from Asia into North America, and this is more of a mid-20th century kind of problem. We're not going to go too far down the taxonomic rabbit hole here, but broadly there are 16 species of what we would call ferritomoid earthworms that we would collectively refer to as jumping worms. So this isn't actually one species, this is multiple species that are related and they act fairly similarly. So they go by lots of different common names. These tend to be very geographically specific. We usually use jumping worms here, but you may also hear snake worms, crazy worms, Asian worms. This is all referring to this group of species that behave similarly. So we're going to just say jumping worms, but keep in mind it's not just one species. So an important question is, well, they just kind of look like worms. Why are these different from European earthworms? They have a number of traits that do differ. They tend to be very shallow burrowing, so they're very active in a concentrated layer of the soil very close to the surface, which is, of course, an important area in terms of nutrients and soil protection and rooting as well. They're parthenogenetic, so essentially they can reproduce on their own. So if you get an individual or a small number of individuals into an area, that's enough for them to reproduce and kickstart a whole population on their own. They have an annual life cycle, which is interesting. Most of our European species do actually live multiple years and they'll overwinter. Jumping worms basically hatch in the spring, live and then die in the fall. So it's a much sort of more rapid life cycle overall. Generally what happens is with European earthworms, when you have very big worms, you don't have many of them in sort of a patch of soil. But jumping worms kind of break that pattern by being both very large-bodied, they're fairly sizable, and they also can have these very dense populations as well. So collectively, all of these traits together essentially make for an invasive species that can have a very profound impact on the soil, and they're very good at getting into a new habitat and setting up shop quite quickly. What we're really worried about here is alteration to the soils. Charles Darwin, this is not his best known work, but it was his last work in his life. It's actually a very interesting read if you have a chance. He was fascinated by earthworms and their importance in the soil and subsequently for vegetation. He referred to them as architects of the soil. They physically, chemically, biologically restructure the soil in a way that has very profound implications for the plants that grow in it. And the same is true of jumping worms. Jumping worms are decomposers, like all other worms, so they're breaking down organic matter, and they convert that topsoil into this layer of material that we call casts or castings. It's circled in the image here. When it's dry, it's got this very sort of crumbly, almost like dried coffee ground-like texture. It's also sort of like a ground beef kind of texture. And that is basically worm poop that's been sort of processed, pooped back out, and then that's your new topsoil that they have created. And it can be quite prolific as well. So this is a shot from a Toronto ravine, and actually all of the dark material here is worm casting. And you can see it's quite depauperate in terms of other vegetation. There's not a lot growing there. And this is sort of the main concern that we talk about with jumping worms from a plant perspective. So the mechanism here again is essentially you're taking what would have been litter and soil and all this material that takes a very long time to break down normally, and it breaks down very quickly. And it gets converted into these casts, and that leaves plants vulnerable to drying out, desiccation. They're very physically exposed, so if you have a lot of deer, for example, or something else, they can find and eat the plants much more readily. This material can be eroded away. That can result in a loss of nutrients and overall fertility. And so at the end of the day, this tends to result in poor performance of vegetation. We often talk about this in the context of forests or sort of other more natural systems, but the same can apply in a garden setting as well if you have a fairly sensitive plant that's sort of suffering from these kinds of impacts. So if we zoom in on the Ontario story specifically, the first records that we have for North America for jumping worms go back to the mid-1800s. They're from California, but the taxonomics of it are all kind of messed up, and these are soft-bodied organisms, so we don't really know. This is not really a reliable record. The best data that we have for the first confirmed sighting of jumping worms in Ontario comes from a site near Windsor. John Reynolds, who's based in Kitchener, he's an earthworm taxonomist. He recorded them there back in 2014. That was kind of the first one on record. And then it was pretty quiet until summer of 2021. We were trying to get on with the work that we actually get paid for, and people started to come to us with sightings of what they felt were sort of strange earthworms. My background is in earthworm ecology with my graduate work, so this is kind of a side project that my supervisors kind of tolerate, and we do what we can with it. So we went out, we did some collections, we did some ID, and lo and behold, that was sort of, we started getting this run of a whole bunch of jumping worms showing up in that summer in 2021. So once we got word out that they were here, of course, people start looking, and then people start finding them. So we got some observations from other places in Ontario and also in the Atlantic provinces as well. And as awareness has spread, the records have only started to come in more and more as well. These data are slightly out of date. This is from a platform called EdMap, so we're going to mention it later as well. This is sort of a county level overview with intensity of the color matching the intensity of the observations submitted. As of August, we've got 44 confirmed records in Ontario through this platform. These numbers are, again, a little bit out of date. I just got back last week from parental leave, so there's a bit of a backlog that's sitting on my desk, so I'm going to be processing that soon. So that number is almost certainly higher. I would guess probably closer to 60, probably by the time I review those records, but the August data is about 44 on the books. A very important thing to note when looking at a map like this is that absence of proof is not proof of absence. So the counties where we don't have any records, that of course doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just means it hasn't been found or it hasn't been recorded yet. As we say, again, the more that people look, the more we're going to find them. It's also worth kind of stepping back and looking at the broader geographic context of this as well. So the Americans have been dealing with jumping worms for a much longer time. They're further south. There's a greater sort of amount of trade connectivity going on. So they've had them for a few decades more than we have, at least on record. We have it in several of the states. You see, again, some big gaps here, but again, I would chalk that more up to sort of reporting, lack of reporting, than actual absence. But basically, we are sort of at the northern extent of where these things are starting to show up. And as things start to get warmer, we're going to see more also. So when we did those initial records in 2021, what we found was we actually have 5 species of jumping worms that we've recorded so far. It doesn't really matter too much which one is which, but I do want to point out sometimes you'll see Amynthus agrestis comes up a lot as a name. It's a very common jumping worm, but it's not the only one. Sometimes it's used as effectively a shorthand for jumping worms, but there are other species, and we have other species in Ontario as well. So just a reminder that this is multiple species we're looking at here. When we collect records of where we've been finding them in Ontario so far, we've collected some other data from people as well to give kind of a snapshot of where people are finding these things. The vast majority of records are coming from private residences. We also have some from parks and conservation areas and schools as well. But a lot are coming from gardens. This is, again, sort of a function of where people are looking for them. But also we know that jumping worms are often introduced through gardens. So they're coming in through soils, through potted plants, exotic plants, mulches, material like that are then traded between gardens or moved from garden to garden. So this is also not a surprising pattern to find. We asked people, what have you been doing on this site? Sort of, do you have any guesses about where this is coming from? And of course, because a lot of these are gardens or they're parks, they're areas that are managed, there's often a lot happening. So things are being planted, topsoil is being added, mulch is being added, and essentially any of these additions are potential pathways for introduction. So yeah, if we ask people, do you think you know where this comes from? Some people maybe have an idea, or maybe they notice something crawling around in the mulch that they added, but in general, we don't know. And that's one of the challenges, and I think one of the stressful and kind of scary things about this is we don't really know exactly how they're always getting into a spot. But there are many different potential avenues for this. So if we look at this at a bit of a different scale as well, that's sort of a big picture for Southern Ontario. If we think a little bit locally, this is work from at the time, undergraduate student in forestry at the University of Toronto, Esther Tang, who I was supervising. She was looking at the local distribution of jumping worms within the Toronto ravine. So we noticed in that first summer that we had jumping worms showing up specifically in the Blythewood ravine, if people are familiar with the area. So she did a survey of, I think it was 13, I'm counting quickly, right? Other ravines in Toronto. No, 11, to see where jumping worms were found. And she got this kind of interesting result of basically jumping worms in 4 out of 11, so roughly a third. So it was kind of a situation where they are definitely here. They're not everywhere, but they are present at this kind of intermediate level. There's a lot of variation between sites as well. So one of the methods that she used at these ravine sites is you walk along the main path, you take a sample survey sort of at fixed intervals. Here we're showing this graphically, these black dots, you would find no jumping worms. A yellow dot, you do find jumping worms. So some of the sites you'd get, say, just 5% of the plots would have jumping worms present, and some of them looked like this. So this was Blythewood, and I think it was 2022, where it was basically 94% of the plots, just, you go 10 steps, jumping worms, 10 steps, jumping worms. And to me, this was really revealing because this didn't happen yesterday, right? This kind of invasion has been happening for multiple years, likely, and just kind of hasn't been recorded yet, right? Also, often a pattern that we would see is at sites where, it was patchier. Often, we don't want to literally sort of point a finger at anybody. That's not what this whole exercise is about. But often they are associated, they're fairly close to a house, to a garden. These ravines often have slopes. So the most likely story that's happening here is that jumping worms come in through probably some sort of non-native exotic horticultural plant that's been planted, and then they move downslope when it rains, and then make their way into the ravine and spread from there. So if we kind of summarize the state of knowledge so far, we know that jumping worms are here in Ontario. They're at multiple locations. We have at least 5 species, probably more. We do think they're probably relatively recent still. A lot of these sites are still quite early, but not all of them. So they've likely been here for at least a few years without us noticing. We see them in gardens, mostly, but they're also managing to escape into nearby natural areas as well, which is also a problem. Kind of overall, at various scales, they're not ubiquitous yet, but they are also not rare. It's kind of the overall state of this. So an important question is, what do we do now? And the we really does encompass sort of everybody as much as possible. This is really sort of an engagement exercise as well. The bitter pill that, well, for some people, bitter pill that does need to be swallowed from the get-go is that non-native earthworms, and that now includes jumping worms, they are already an inevitable and growing part of Canadian soils. Just like European earthworms starting several hundred years ago, we're stuck on this trajectory. Jumping worms are here, they're going to become more common. Most gardens will have them in sort of a certain period of time that we can't define yet. And that kind of needs to be accepted as a fact. There are a variety of reasons for that, namely of which we don't have practical control options. We'll get back to this because there are some caveats on this in certain specific scenarios, but at a large scale, we don't really have anything practical. These are below ground species, so they're very easy to miss. In particular, those cocoons, very, very difficult to screen for. We can find them in the lab, but it takes a lot of work. They can move around through all sorts of different dispersal vectors that we talked about earlier. And on sort of a pragmatic economic level, there just isn't enough of an immediate incentive economically to put policy restrictions on this. Earthworms definitely do economic damage, but it's very complex and it's very downstream. It's hard to sort of quantify compared to, for example, a wood borer that destroys sort of a timber crop. And so that means that we don't see a lot of policy restricting their import or regulation. So for all these reasons, they're here to stay. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything and that there's nothing for us to do. What we do depends very much on which group of earthworms we're talking about. These are different contexts here. So European earthworms, this is an invasion that's been going on since the 1500s. They're abundant, widespread. We don't have a way to control them, and there's a fairly reasonable argument that eventually they're becoming sort of naturalized part of the soil fauna as well, once they've been here for hundreds of years. In this case, what we advocate is essentially learning to live with them, which is honestly what a lot of people already do. Some people aren't even aware that they're non-native in the first place. This was actually the focus of a lot of my graduate work, was looking at how do you integrate non-native invasive species into management planning. Jumping worms are different, however. This is relatively recent. They're not yet widespread. Similarly, we don't have good ways to control them, but we do have options at this stage to slow the spread, and that slowing the spread is very important. So what we want to do is learn where they are and slow the spread, and that's something that everybody can theoretically help with. So as I've said, community science stewardship are really vital in this kind of project. There are only a few of us working on this kind of thing, and we have very limited capacity. As I said, this isn't even one of our main projects. It's just something that is important and we're interested in. So we really need that kind of community engagement to make this work. So to help facilitate that, we've put together this 4-step process here that we're going to go through today. The steps include learning how to identify jumping worms, keeping an eye open for them, basically, reporting observations that you think, if you think you've seen them, and then, of course, using best practices to slow the spread in those areas where they have been identified. So we're going to start with learning how to identify jumping worms. I'm going to say now, before I forget, we've got the lights off now, so I won't do this now, but at the end, after we do some questions, or maybe when we do questions, we can put the lights up. I've got some specimens here in just ethanol, so we can pass those around, and you can sort of take a look at a non-moving specimen if you want to see what you're looking at here. But we've got some photos and videos as well. So you need to know what you're looking for. Fortunately, for jumping worms, I'd say once you know what you're looking for, it's pretty obvious and pretty easy. After we started to get those initial sightings in 2021, we put together a number of different sort of outreach sheets and videos and fact sheets, and started doing presentations like this to a lot of different groups. And those communities and groups have then gone on to help spread the word further. We've had some great partnerships with the Master Gardeners of Ontario, the Invasive Species Centre, Toronto Nature Stewards, and many, many others who've really helped spread the word about this. So the way that I recommend approaching this is to figure out if you're looking at a jumping worm. It's kind of a sort of 2-step process. First, you're looking for habitat alteration. So these are below ground species, so you don't necessarily see the worm themselves first. You typically see what they've done to the soil. Once you spot that, then you check the worm itself, and you're looking at a combination of behavior and morphology. What does it do, and what does it look like? So the habitat that you're looking for, we've already seen this. These are these casts, the castings, this kind of coffee ground beef material on the ground. So we're looking for this. This is what you'll see first. The casts are often in sort of wet shaded areas. That would be the kind of habitat they prefer. So often kind of underneath something in the lee of a log or a trunk, sort of along, brick lining, that kind of thing. It's often spread evenly across large patches of ground. So as long as it's not just a few worms, if it's a larger population, the casts are often very even and spread out like we see in the photo. Again, basically, excuse me, all of this dark material is that casting here. Everything that's not sort of litter is cast. Non-jumping worms, some will form casts like this at the surface as well, but they are spatially aggregated. They're in these little clumps like we see on the left here. These are called middens. These are formed by dew worms or night crawlers, if you're familiar with the species, but you see there's gaps between them, right? So jumping worm casts spread out, loose, deposited sort of on the ground. Depending on the age of the infestation and also the number of worms and the soil type and all of this, this layer may be very shallow, like a centimeter, or it might be several centimeters deep. I've got a video here. This is probably the worst that I've seen it. This is one from one of the Toronto ravines again. You can see here, it looks like soil, but this is actually all just cast. So it's just very, very loose material. You can sort of imagine how this is a very poor rooting medium as well. So you can sort of see there the texture is different from what you would expect from a soil. So if it's dry enough, you can just kind of pass a hand or a boot or something like that through it, and it'll just sort of part like that. Okay, this is where it gets fun. So the behavior. So if you see the cast, then you're looking for the worms. The worms live close to the surface. They actually live in that casting material. So once you've seen that, you want to search that. excuse me, for the worms themselves. So you can part them with just a boot or a tool or sort of hand or however you want to get in there, and they'll be pretty close to the surface if they are there. What you're looking for, the name jumping worm comes from a behavior that they have to avoid being eaten. So no worm wants to be eaten, they all generally sort of thrash around, but jumping worms have a very specific, very particular kind of S-shaped thrashing that they do side to side when you pick them up. It's very fast, very twitchy, and very distinctive. So we're going to see it a couple of times here, what this sort of looks like. So you see the cast, you are searching through it a little bit, you find a worm, you pick it up, and you look to see if it does this. Yeah. And then you're a little grossed out and disappointed that you found one. So that's what you're looking for. So again, all worms will kind of twitch around, but it's a very particular kind of motion. We'll see one here that's even more kind of twitchy, I would say. See, they're sort of coiling up one way and then all the way around the other way, sort of in an S shape. And often they will actually get out of your hand. That's what they're trying to do. Here's another one. This is from some colleagues at the Royal Botanical Gardens alongside a trail path. This is just sort of some mulch along a path. It also gives you an idea of the kind of densities that you can see in the field as well and how close they are to the surface. It's very quick, but you'll see here. Yeah. Okay, so if you see that, that is definitely a jumping worm. Okay, so this is a very, very diagnostic behavior. So the one nice thing about the system is that they're pretty easy to spot. They have a few other behaviors as well, although the jumping is sort of the big giveaway. Most of the species can self-amputate their tail if disturbed as well, so another trick to try and avoid being eaten. They'll drop off that last set of segments, but again, they don't do this every time, so it's not as reliable. And then the worms themselves are quite different also. So this is an adult jumping worm. This is an adult dew worm, which is sort of the comparable European earthworm of a similar size. Some of the major differences, I would say, compared to the European worms, the jumping worms have an even sort of smoother, shiny body. They tend to have more of a gray-brown color than more of the pigmented sort of reddy brown that you see in a lot of the European species. This structure here near the head is called a clitellum. It's a reproductive structure that they use to form cocoons. It is sort of a milky white color in the jumping worms, whereas it's more of a pinky red in the European worms. It also forms a full ring. So this is the top side of the worm. If you were to turn them over, that ring keeps going all the way around as a full hoop. On a European earthworm, it's more like a saddle, where it's on the top, it comes down the side, and then it stops. There's a break on the bottom. That trait is also very, very good, but it's only found on adults. So if you have a juvenile earthworm early in the season, they won't have that clitellum structure developed yet, so you can't use that for identification. It's also very important to know what you're looking for at different times of the year. So as I mentioned, these are annual species, so they hatch in the spring. They will be at very low densities, they're very small, basically impossible to tell from other sorts of earthworms. As you get into the summer and the fall, they start to mature, they get larger, and their alteration of the soil becomes more pronounced. So the best time to spot them is in, I would say, sort of September, October, basically now is kind of a really good time to look for them. As things start cooling off, they start to die off. They're producing cocoons that go into the soil, and then the adults die. And then so into the winter, the adults are all dead, and the cocoons are present but very difficult to detect, and they overwinter as cocoons, waiting to hatch until the next spring. So it's really very seasonal in terms of where you see them. We'll get into this again later, but this is another one of the frustrating things about dealing with jumping worms, is that the easiest time to see them and to identify them is kind of late in the season, often after material has already been added and they've sort of been doing their thing. This is one of the challenges. But what it does mean is if you're looking in the spring and you don't see anything suspicious, that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily there. So once you know what to look for, you're a jumping worm ID expert, you want to keep your eyes open for them sort of at home, out on the trail, wherever you may be. Broadly, just kind of keep your eyes open. That cast material, once you see it, very, very obvious. So you want to look for the casts, check for the worms, check for behavior and morphology, and if you think you have what might be a jumping worm, so if it's got that twitchiness, if it's got a clitellum that runs all the way around the body, take a photo. Take a quick photo of the worm, of the casts. Ideally, the sort of gold standard would be just a quick few seconds long phone video showing that kind of jumping behavior, because that really tells us for sure what we're looking at. That can then be uploaded to a platform called EdMaps. Yes?
We talk about the sort of quick questions, but you talk about looking down on the earth.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the garden from the standpoint of the actual plant that would indicate that they're jumping worms? And so is there any effect on, visual effect on the plant that would be your first clue to look for?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question so you want to?
Yep, so the question was, you know, we've been talking so far about looking at alterations to the soil. Is there anything that you can see in the plants themselves as sort of a telltale sign that there's something going on? Excuse me. Often what we're looking at is, you know, that in an invaded area, you're going to have general poor condition of plants. You may have mortality, you may have just sort of general sort of poor condition, right? So sort of growth, sort of chlorotic, various other sort of features, just generally indicating that the plant is under stress. So that could obviously be caused by a number of different things. So it's not sort of a one-to-one symptom that you're going to be looking at. But I know with gardeners, often what does happen is they'll sort of say, these plants were doing great, now they look very unhappy, I'm trying to figure out what's going on, look at the soil at the base of it, oh, it's all sort of granular, what's going on here, and then that points you to the worms. So I get into that in a second here as well, but broadly, if they're not doing well for some reason, this could be one of the explanations for that. Yes?
The survival of seedlings, very small plants, would that be a sign as well that kind of baby plants or everything?
Yep, yeah, so I don't have good data on this because, again, this is relatively new here in Ontario, but theoretically, yeah, that is definitely something we would expect to see is, say, mortality of seedlings for the reasons that we mentioned earlier, where the soil is just very exposed, they're drying out, things are eating them, maybe the fine root structures they're trying to put out are being browsed or just physically disrupted, and we see a lot of mortality that can't otherwise be explained. That could be another clue that there's something going on there. Yes? So I mean, that would be the case for a lot of the source populations, you know, sort of the Asian populations where these things are happening. It's a completely different ecological context where they have predators, you have different climatic regimes that sort of permit them. We know that temperature is definitely a constraint on these populations, so one of the reasons we've seen them in the States more than we've seen them here so far is because of our cold winters. Our winters are getting less cold, less wintry, and not as long, and so that is one of the reasons we are expecting an increase in this in sort of time to come.
In Mexico, there's no way to kill all the parasites in the soil.
Right.
And they have a terrible time with pests.
Yeah, so this is a very similar sort of situation where we've been benefiting from those winters that are, sort of decreasing in their winteriness. So once you have a potential sighting, so something that you think is a jumping worm, you've got a photo, you've got some videos, what is most useful to the broader community, the scientific community, the policy community, is to report those observations online. We're working with partners at the Invasive Species Centers and also OFAH, and the platform that they've encouraged us to sort of use for this is EdMaps. I know a lot of people are already iNaturalist users. These are, you know, different platforms, different pros and cons to them. EdMaps tends to be a bit of a better platform from a research perspective in terms of the kind of data that can be entered into it. So that's just what is being used for this particular set of species. EdMaps sort of works like a lot of these other platforms, though, works very much like iNaturalist. You just sort of have to log in, you know, it's free, it's fairly easy to use. You'd be entering sightings under jumping worms. Family Megascelicidae is sort of the categorization of that, but if you just put jumping worms, it will come up. It's sort of a fairly standard interface where you just want to put in a location, at least one photo of what you're seeing are the essential fields, and then there are other details that you can add if you want. Those are obviously useful to us, but they're not required. So things like where you found them, if you have suspicions about where they came from, any of that other added context is really useful. Unfortunately, EdMaps doesn't let you submit video to the platform, but if you do have a video, what we sort of do is a report gets submitted, those get sent to an expert sort of person for identification, which in this system is me, so I'll get a notification of that. I look at the report, and then we either say, yes, it's a jumping worm, no, it's not, or we need some additional information. If we need additional information, the best thing is a video, so we'll sort of email, and if you can email that to me, then that lets us say yes or no with better confidence. So then the report gets approved or not, and then it enters this public database that anyone can look at to see where they are, and it can also be used by the scientific community as we try and sort of figure this all out as well. So this is really a vital resource in trying to figure out what the bigger picture here is. Privacy is, of course, an understandable barrier that some people run into this. So some people are happy to just put down the exact latitude and longitude of their garden if that's where they found it, but understandably some people don't want to do that. So if that's the case, there's a little radial icon that you can check and just say hide latitude, longitude, and then that information is not public. I can see that as an administrator, but that is private information, so we don't do anything with that, and that's not publicly visible. So it'll sort of generalize it to, I forget what the actual distance is, but it'll just sort of jitter where it's coming from and sort of give you, it's in this county, but we don't know broader than that. So yeah, whether you want to show the location or not, submitting here is incredibly useful to us. And then finally, of course, you want to use best practices to slow the spread. We've said this is an inevitable process, but slowing it down is still very important. Our ecosystems, our gardens, all of these are under a great deal of different kinds of stress. This cumulative stress is what really does them in. In the case of invasive species like this, when the invasion is more gradual, it gives them time to adapt in various ways. What I always sort of think of is, if you imagine a European earthworm, one of the images that comes to mind immediately is a robin eating an earthworm. Those are, you have a native species and a non-native species in an association that didn't originally exist. That's a learned behavior. We're going to see that kind of thing with jumping worms over time as well, but it takes time, potentially hundreds of years, to develop some of these associations for our ecosystems and our gardens to push back. So we want to buy that time as much as possible. So it's essentially the same process that we just talked about. Know what to look for and keep an eye open for them. Of course, you can't do anything if you don't know that they're there. So that includes looking at your garden, nearby natural areas, any material that gets brought in, so like a potted plant, bags of soil, bags of mulch, plants being shared from a plant sale or a neighbor's garden, any of those materials. Watch for casts, watch for worms. Okay, this is the part that people always sort of want, and it's where we can offer the least, which is, unfortunate, but it's how things are right now. When infestations are very, very small and very contained, it is possible to sort of nip it in the bud. So if a population is small, so let's say it's contained to a small contained garden bed, or it's in one potted plant, that material can be dealt with. You can pick worms out, you can throw them in alcohol or soapy water to euthanize them. We also know that solarization is very effective at killing not just the worms, but the tricky part is the cocoons, right? You can pick out all the adult worms, but if there's a tiny, tiny little brown specks that are the cocoons and you miss those, that's a whole new population. So high temperatures in excess of 40 degrees centigrade will kill them over a 3+ day period. So bagging material in, so black plastic, for example, putting that out on a sunny day is, for at least 3 days, is the best way to sterilize that material that can then be reused or disposed of as you sort of wish. The problem, of course, is that is only practical when you're dealing with small or contained volumes. Once you get past that, we start to run out of options. People use some fairly creative attempts, I would say. We hear and read about and see some interesting and quite frankly dangerous or unsafe interventions. I know at least in one group, there were reports of someone who went about in their backyard with, I think, a little blowtorch and sort of individually sort of flamethrowered them. I think it was a cathartic process, but it was not an effective process. There are also a lot of things that you can pour on your soil that will kill earthworms, they'll kill jumping worms, but it'll kill everything else as well and become an environmental hazard also. So the sort of bottom line is that currently there are no practical, safe, effective, scientifically supportive interventions for jumping worms at any kind of meaningful scale. People are looking into that, biological control, specific sort of chemicals, these kinds of things, but right now that doesn't exist. Yes? Yes, so again, 40 degrees Celsius for at least 3 days will kill the worms and the cocoons. The problem is just processing the amount of volume that is sort of practical to do that. If it's very contained, you can do that. Once it's larger, cat's kind of out of the bag, and that becomes prohibitive. For people who want to get a little experimental, the University of Minnesota is doing an excellent sort of piece of community outreach and research looking at jumping worm management. They recently put out a report that has several what I would call sort of home remedies of people trying various different soil additives and different interventions. They've had some success with these with reducing jumping worm populations, but nothing gets rid of them fully, right? And that's really the trick, right? You can reduce the numbers, that's helpful, but if you don't keep doing that, those numbers are just going to creep right back up as well. What we really want to do is focus on containment. So if we know they're in an area, we want to try and keep them in that area and limit the spread to other non-infested areas at that point. So we've talked about different pathways by which they move around, so we want to try and limit those. So if new plants are coming in, we want to keep an eye on them, quarantine them if necessary if we're uncertain about them, sterilize if we really have to. If we know we have jumping worms in a particular area, avoiding sharing plants out of that area, consider that sort of under a kind of lockdown at that point. When we talk to garden clubs in particular, bare wash root is sort of an option that some clubs have started to go with for their plant sales. These are some photos from the Collingwood Garden Club. They had a sort of fairly elaborate setup where they're using sort of screening and washing and getting rid of that material, being very, very diligent about that. This obviously requires a lot of work. And because we know that jumping worms are not going to go anywhere, it becomes a bit of an interesting question of, how long are we going to do this for? Are we going to do this for the first 5 years? Are we going to do this forever? These aren't bad things to do, but they are very much individual by individual, group by group sort of discussions about the pros and cons, about the risk and how much work this requires and how much labor you have to sort of assign to other priorities that you have as well. So happy to address this further in questions afterwards, but there are things that you can do, but it's always a question of how far are you willing to sort of take that, and that's an individual kind of decision. Yeah.
You're doing all that washing, so going to that container, then where do you put the water, the possible cocoons?
Yeah, so the water that they're washing then gets strained through this second step here. So this is a coarse sieve to get all the sort of soil debris off. And then they were passing it over a finer filter to collect the physical material. That's where the cocoons would be, if anywhere. And then that got bagged up and solarized and sterilized. So the water would be clean. It would be this physical residue that's coming off that they then solarize.
The way we did it for our fields, that we washed on site. Like, some people do it down there, but we washed on site. And if you've got worms, then they wash in your soil, that's not spreading, right? The soil is staying where it came from.
Yeah.
Then if they're putting fresh soil, who knows that that's potting soil in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the location is a big part of it as well. Sort of thinking about every aspect of that process and all the materials that you're using for it, like what you're repotting into and all that kind of thing. Mulch soil compost, sort of the temperature factor applies here again. If materials have been heat treated, that gives you better assurance that there is sort of lower likelihood of something being in there. One of the challenges with heating large piles of compost and things like that is worms can move. So if the temperature gets too hot, they can hop out of that pile and climb back in once it's sort of cooled off. Or you heat one pile, it's clean, but then they move from whatever's beside it into that pile. So it's also not a guarantee, but it is a little bit of added insurance if you're pursuing that as well. Yeah.
We don't mix our soil anymore. When I trained in horticulture 50 years ago, we made our own soil.
Mm-hmm.
We mold, we sterilized it all in sterilizer.
Yep.
And then we would take the leaf mold, we would have to put it on a bench and take a spade, chop it up, and we mix it with peat moss
Mm-hmm.
and perlite and things like that.
And it's a lot of work, right? Yes, I come from a soils background and we create a lot of artificial soils for experiments, and it's an awful lot of work. And a lot of this comes down to what is practical at scale, right? I think that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with here. There are things that you can do that work very well, but they don't scale well. That's the challenge. And then sort of the final little bit here is treads. As we talked about, the cocoons can get stuck in mud, they can get stuck on wheels and footwear and tools and things like that. So this is just general good sort of biosanitary protocols, is try and be conscious of wiping off your feet when you're moving from area to area, garden to garden, tools that you're moving, try and clean those off as well. That's going to help with all sorts of invasive weeds as well as earthworms here. This is something that I added just recently, actually, after talking to some landowners about, well, what do I actually do if I have jumping worms and they seem to be causing problems for a plant? And really what this gets at is, if we can't do a lot about the jumping worms, once they're somewhere, they're going to stay there. We can reduce the numbers a little bit, but they're part of that soil now. If we think it's causing problems for a particular plant, for example, in our garden, what we can really focus on is other stressors, right? Jumping worms or European earthworms are rarely going to be fatal to a plant on their own. What they can do is be another hand on the scale that causes them problems as sort of a stress. They're depleting their nutrients, they're drying them out, whatever it may be, that gets added on top of all the other stresses that they're dealing with, right? So some of the things that we might think about would be sort of drought from climate change, other invasive species that are competing with them, browsing from deer, or sort of seed predation from mammals, or whatever it may be. So if we can't do something about the jumping worms, what we can do is try and target some of the other factors that are causing problems, try and minimize those stresses so that the cumulative load on the plant of interest is reduced. So essentially we're sort of looking after the parts of it that we can look after to try and baby it through this process. That's sort of a general advice that we give if plants seem to be having a hard time with the worm invasion. So to wrap up and conclude on this, what we know is jumping worms are here. They're in Ontario, they're spreading, they're going to become more and more common. They can and do have dramatic negative effects on soils and the plants that are in those soils. Most of this research comes from natural settings, but we certainly have a lot of anecdotal information about people having trouble in gardens as well, although it really depends on the species. Further invasion is inevitable. Jumping worms are here to stay and they're going to become more common, but it is still important and valuable to learn where they are, how they're moving around, and try to slow that spread down as much as possible to give our gardens and our forests time to adapt to these new soil organisms. And we can support biodiversity, we can support our garden plants that are having trouble with this by reducing cumulative stress that's coming from other sources. So try and keep them happy as we can in other respects so that they can deal with the stress from the jumping worms in this case specifically. So in terms of management and reporting and awareness, again, this 4-step process: learn what you're looking for, keep an eye open for them, report observations if you see something that looks suspicious, and then use the best practices that we talked about to try and slow the spread as much as possible. In terms of additional resources, the Invasive Species Center has an excellent Meet the Species profile page about jumping worms with links and other information. We did a webinar a couple of years ago now, I guess, that Royal Botanical Gardens hosted with a number of other organizations. A lot of the talk will be a little familiar to what we did here today, but we had a greater focus on that reporting process. We had someone from OFAH, I believe it was, talking about EdMaps as a platform. So if you're curious about or having trouble with the EdMaps platform, you can check out that on YouTube for more information about how to submit a report. And there are also the University of Minnesota reports if you want to get kind of funky and experimental with what you're trying out, keeping in mind that none of these are sort of proven, safe, sort of effective options to go with. We have an info sheet that we update semi-regularly. This is sort of the most recent iteration of this. I believe this has already been made available, sort of, I think, to some of the leadership here, but if not, it can be. So this can be distributed, this can be available to you, and if you want to share this with anyone who's interested as well, that's always useful. Kind of gives a bit of a one-page summary of what to look for, why this matters, and how to report and what to do. So yeah, a big thank you to everyone here for having me out again as well. I think we've got some time for some questions. If we have lights, we've got some worms that we can pass around carefully. They're in glass jars with ethanol. I'll say we have some adult jumping worms and we have juvenile jumping worms, and we'll sort of pass them around in different directions, but you can sort of see what they look like late in the season and early in the season, and really note that early on it's very difficult to tell what you're looking at there. And then, yeah, happy to do some questions. Yes? Oh, yeah.
What predators do they have? in Ontario?
Not many so far. So figuring out what's eating them actually takes quite a bit of work. There are ways that you can do that. You can do gut content analyses and look for the setae, which are the little hairs on them in the guts of birds and amphibians and things like that. Because this is also new, this hasn't really been done for jumping worms in Ontario yet, but probably will. Anecdotally, jumping worms are very good at not being eaten, is one of the challenges. A lot of their adaptations have to do with predator avoidance. So far it looks like a lot of our would-be invertebrate predators that are going after European earthworms, for example, don't quite know what to make of them yet. That changes over time, right? They'll pick up new diseases, new parasites, new predators, but that takes time. So that's something we're gonna sort of be monitoring as these kind of novel trophic interactions emerge. But right now, one of the reasons they seem to do so well is not that much tends to eat them or make them ill, essentially. Yeah.
The planarian from Asia that,
Pass that around there. We'll start this over here. Yeah.
that eats worms has been reported, and is that likely to become an invertebrate predator of jumping worms?
Yeah, so there are a number of, there's actually a couple of species of planarians, so flatworms that are predators of a variety of earthworms and other sort of soil invertebrates. They've started to show up. This is another group of organisms that I believe this is the broad-headed flatworm, I think is one of them. There's not been a lot of research on these yet. One of the concerns is that they are generalist predators of soil invertebrates, so they probably will go after non-native earthworms, but they'll also go after native soil fauna as well. So it's certainly not something we would want to rely on as sort of a targeted biocontrol, but yes, this probably would become another sort of lever that helps keep their population in check, one of these sort of natural rebalancing mechanisms that emerges over time. With the flatworms specifically, there's still not a lot of good data about to what extent they're actually creating self-sustaining populations in sort of natural settings. You know, we see them in gardens and they'll be there for a season. The question is, are they reproducing? I haven't seen compelling evidence on it yet, but as things continue to warm up, probably. So I think that will become a bit of a natural balancing mechanism over time, but it, again, takes time. Yeah. Let's start here and we'll work our way back. Yes?
Is that the color of some, or is it because of the ethanol or the?
Yeah, so the deadness and ethanol do alter the color a little bit, but they do have that sort of gray-brown kind of pallor. So earthworm pigmentation is often a reflection of where they live in the soil. So even within European earthworms, there are fairly sort of drab gray earthworms. They tend to live underground because they don't need the camouflage. The reddier brown ones are ones that live or spend time on the surface where they want that visual sort of camouflage from sort of avian predators and things like that. So for example, like a dew worm is brown on the top, gray on the bottom because the top is what shows. But yeah, that sort of grayness is pretty typical. Yeah, yes?
You mentioned they're in Ontario, but I wondered if they've also gone into Quebec and
Could you repeat the question for?
Yeah. So the question is, you know, we know they're in Ontario. Are they in Quebec? Are they other places? So Quebec, I believe we have started getting some sightings. I know the maritime provinces as well. Not so much north or west. Sort of, again, sort of that southern sort of low-hanging tip of Canada seems to be where we're seeing them for the most part. You can also get strong microhabitat effects as well. So because they come through horticultural sort of vectors for the most part, if they're ending up in a nice warm greenhouse or sort of, you know, conservatorium or something like that, you know, you can have populations that are isolated and surviving on their own, but not really thriving in the wild. It's sort of, we're expecting a bit of a northward sort of expansion over time. Yes?
Can you have both things, the European and the jumping worms, cohabitating in the same area of soil?
Yeah, so that's an interesting aspect. We have some data from the Toronto ravines where typically what we see, we're still sort of working on some of the analysis, but anecdotally when we're walking around, you would see a plot and it would be a lot of European earthworms or it would be a lot of jumping worms. So the jumping worms actually seem to displace the European earthworms for the most part. We think they sort of work on the surface of the soil and work very, very quickly. So they're probably depleting those organic residues, mostly leaf litter and other organic matter, before the European earthworms below them can get to it. So they actually sort of outcompete the European non-natives. So it's non-natives competing with other non-natives. Yes?
Actually, I have a question for the group, but has anybody here seen jumping worms in their garden?
No, I've seen them in High Park. I reported them in High Park.
Is that right?
Yes.
We just look at the photos, and if that was submitted recently, that may have fallen into the parental leave sort of
Like last year.
Okay, so we probably confirmed it then at that point? Yes, okay, yeah. So it's there, and you can actually see all those records on EdMaps if you want to log in and take a look.
None of Kathy's garden, right?
Yeah. Okay, Clement?
I'm a member of a number of native plant organizations, and collectively we have been promoting the idea of leaving the leaves on the soil as a shelter for invertebrates like butterflies, moths, bees, etc. Of course, the removal of the leaves by the worms reduces that cover.
Yeah.
But what I see from your time of the year things is that they probably aren't removing leaves much until about June.
Yeah,
Right?
it's sort of a gradual process, but yeah, that's when it would become most sort of prominent. So any process that's happening before that, isn't as strongly as impacted as sort of something later in the season. It's true, yeah, and that's a good point. But what it does affect too is that it's about the sort of, we often have a fairly strong duff layer as well that is being broken down primarily by fungi over a long period of time, and that whole layer that might have taken many, many years to break down can be depleted in a single season. So, you get annual inputs of litter fall coming in, but they'll deplete that plus everything that was there sort of all in one fell swoop. So they're sort of affecting that long-term buildup as well by essentially preventing the buildup. It's part of the challenge, yeah. Yes?
I was just wondering if there are any studies that have been done or taken done on how the jumping worms affect soil fauna and biology. I know it obviously affects structure, but I'm also wondering about.
Yeah, I mean, not in Canada, and again, sort of the repeated answer, and that is just, again, because it's so recent, but these are all very important areas to kind of look at. Because of the overall simplification of the soil profile and the depletion of that sort of humic layer and that duff layer, what we would tend to expect is a depletion of sort of soil fauna and flora biodiversity. So because, again, there's so much less complexity to that soil structure, it's being homogenized into this loose cast material, we tend to see a decrease, at least a shift, but often a decrease in overall biodiversity of sort of the little critters and also microbes that are living in there. That's what we tend to see with European earthworms, and it's what we would expect to see with jumping worms as well. And that has, of course, knock-on effects on overall function and biodiversity as well. Yeah.
I have some questions that I'm reading out from the chat. Carrie Allison has been busy and has got 4 questions in there. So
All right.
I'll put them all out to you and you can.
Sounds good.
So she said that she's seen them all the way through Rosedale and Richwood Park.
Yeah.
She says we may pay a ton for worm castings instead of compost to feed the soil, so it's different with these worms. Then she's asking, Norwegian maple leaves don't seem to break down in the garden over winter. Would they be an effective smother for jumping worm eggs over winter? And finally, what is the purpose of jumping worms from an ecological perspective in their native habitat?
Purpose of a native, so that's interesting. Okay, a lot there, but if I missed something, let me know. So in terms of, so castings can be a soil amendment that we use. It adds fertility. Earthworms are decomposers. They're providing nutrients. Earthworm casts can be added for sort of fertility benefits. That is true and would theoretically be true for jumping worm casts as well. But of course, it's a balance of different effects. Casts tend to also contain cocoons. Cocoons produce adult earthworms. Those earthworms have other effects like browsing on roots, depleting litter layer, all sorts of other things. So you're going to get a nutrient enrichment, but you're also going to get other effects with it that the net effect of which might be negative depending on the species that you're dealing with. So certainly at this point, worm casts from European earthworms, cat's kind of out of the bag on that one for sure. So that can be a very viable soil amendment that can be used and can be purchased. We certainly wouldn't advocate for sort of a jumping worm cast-based amendment, even though it would be a good source of nutrients. The trade-offs from the other effects of introducing a population kind of wouldn't be worth it in this case. Litter type. So we know that earthworms are choosy with their food. So leaf litter is a big part of their diet. And we know they have preferences. I actually did some of this work back in undergraduate, sort of fun stuff, looking at how they choose between different types of litter and things like that. They definitely have preferences. but they are also fairly flexible. So if they have options, they will go for things that break down very quickly, things that don't have a lot of nasty sort of secondary defense compounds and things that make them very bitter or very tough. But if they don't have a choice or they run out of other food, they're generally fairly flexible at eating even very surprising kind of litters. So even conifer needles, for example, can be consumed by a lot of different earthworm species if they're desperate enough. So, typically what we see is not an absence in earthworm population, but maybe a smaller one and a slower growing one just because the diet is sort of not ideal. So if we had sort of Norway maple leaves or conifer needles or something like that, probably going to be a lower, slower growing population, but not keep them out entirely. And there's a last piece to that maybe?
Do they have a purpose in their native habitats?
They just are like other sort of species, so they are a food resource for things that eat them. They are soil decomposers. They help cycle nutrients through that system just as sort of our native earthworms and soil sort of invertebrates do here. But they have checks and balances that keep their populations from getting out of check in those native habitats. They have diseases, they have predators that sort of keep that population from growing too large. So they're doing the same sort of thing, but we don't have those population balances that keeps them from having too much of that particular effect. So it's also an interesting philosophical question. Yes? No, and I don't know much about it, unfortunately, myself.
Question, please?
Cutworms. I don't hear much about them. I suppose we don't as much. It's not something I'm familiar with personally. Maybe someone else has more experience with it.
Cutworms are beetle-like.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, not a system I've worked with personally, but aware of them, yeah. Yes?
Cold temperatures, what activity kills the things? Like how far north could they potentially go? Like at something like Thunder Bay or something like too cold, too long. Is that threshold?
Yeah. Yes, so the question was, again, in terms of thresholds, temperature thresholds, so sort of what is too cold for them, basically. There are numbers on this, not ones that I can bring sort of off the top of my head. I know we don't see them too far north. We are kind of the northern extent of it, to the best of our knowledge so far. It's, temperatures, cold temperatures aren't always necessarily the problem per se. Earthworm cocoons are actually fairly good at tolerating even freezing temperatures. When jumping worms turn the soil into that casting material, that acts as a thermal buffer. So that's where they lay their cocoons, and it actually helps keep them warm. The problem is more about if you have a very short, cold growing season, sort of growing season as it were for the worms, they're not able to sort of reproduce fast enough, sort of develop properly. I think there is published data on that, I just don't know it off the top of my head. I know that we stopped seeing them in the Toronto ravines after temperatures, average daily temperatures went below 5 degrees, was when we saw the die off sort of in kind of November-ish, more or less here. Yeah. Yes?
Are you concerned about people who use worms for fishing, but don't decide these are really good because they do bring so much, and then get loose and
Probably, that will probably contribute. So the concern is about earthworms as fishing, jumping worms as fishing bait. We know that European earthworms, one of the big ways they've got around, especially in the north, is as bait. So you go in with worms for bait, you have some extras, you sort of make the compassionate move and dump them sort of in the soil when you're done if you have extras, and that's a brand new population. So we have a lot of pockets of sort of northern populations that are up there, and that's kind of where they've come from. Jumping worms, I would suspect, are pretty good bait, and once people figure that out, maybe there'll be an industry in sort of dealing with that. And as we talked about before, currently no regulation or policy or restriction on that. So that would be an unfortunate situation, but I also wouldn't sort of be completely surprised by that. So I think sort of awareness, outreach, and sort of crossing our fingers on that is kind of the best that we can do.
Okay, one last question.
Question and statement. So if we're trying to be good stewards, there's 2 parts to it. City compost, because they gather stuff from all over, should we even use city compost? I know most people don't want to use it for vegetable gardens. And then in terms of even leaves, some people like collecting other people's leaves to use in their garden, shred or whatever. Should we stop considering that?
Right. So city compost, material that's being sourced from all sorts of different places, other sources of sort of compost and mulch, these kinds of materials, should we be using them for this kind of thing? So this is actually a good point probably to close on, and that's that all of this is about dealing with different trade-offs and different sort of priorities, right? So jumping worms matter. This is sort of a major ecological threat that we're dealing with right now. The damage to gardens and natural settings is very real and very problematic. But we also have a lot of other priorities that we're trying to deal with from a conservation standpoint, as a horticultural society, as sort of a homeowner and a gardener, and all these things need to be kind of weighed together, right? So with something like municipal compost, that's a great resource that it would be a shame to stop using because of one specific risk associated with jumping worms in particular. So a lot of this kind of comes down to, again, weighing risks and sort of precautions. I think for the most part, the benefits of these things to other goals that we're trying to achieve in terms of gardening, in terms of landscape management and this sort of thing, behoove us to continue using it. We want to try and be careful, obviously, and encourage proper heat treatment. I don't know exactly what their policy on that is. Be aware of material that's coming in, inspect it before it gets applied to a site. Take precautionary steps without going too far and shutting everything down. Like we said, jumping worms are here and they're going to become more common, so we don't want to panic about it, but we do want to sort of do the steps that we can and try and be cautious and try and slow it down as much as possible, which is, finding that balance can be a little bit tricky, but I think there is a balance in there somewhere. And I'll say also, if there's questions that you haven't had a chance to answer or ask, or something that comes up after the fact, I think my email is in there somewhere. It's certainly on the info sheet as well that's available. So please feel free to reach out. If you have sightings, those can go to EdMaps, and those will eventually find their way to me, and I can confirm or sort of deny on that. And if you have other questions, feel free to get in touch, and I'd be happy to address those. So, thanks very much. Thanks, Rob. Hand that back.
Thanks, Michael, for such an amazing presentation.